Hello, everyone. My name is John Mumm. I'm a water planner with the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. We're going to let people to jump on for a few more minutes, and then we'll get this started. Hello, everyone. My name is John Mumm. I'm a water planner with the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. Today's presentation is about the water use sector of industry, commercial, mining, and power, and looking into the resilience assessment input from the public on this piece. I will be presenting this with the Interstate Stream Commission Deputy Director, Hannah Risley-White, and I will let her kick this off.
Thanks, John. And thank you everybody who's joining us today. Again, my name is Hannah Risley-White. I'm the Interstate Stream Commission Deputy Director. And the purpose of today's webinar, as part of this series of webinars last week and this week, is to focus on how to start discussions related to resilience for industry, commercial, mining, and power water uses in the state of New Mexico. And I'll get into a context a little bit more in a moment. But first, I really just want to acknowledge our partners on this project. So you'll see on the slide here some logos of folks that have been key players here. The New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources has played a significant part in providing the science foundation for this 50-year water plan. In addition, we're working really closely with Water Resources Research Institute, New Mexico Water Dialogue, the New Mexico Indian Affairs Department, and also not listed here, but an important part of this process is a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We have a planning assistance to the state's grant through them, and so they're doing a lot of work in support of 50-year water plan as well. And then I also just have to acknowledge in the last couple of weeks, we've had significant discussions with our state agency partners and really want to thank those folks for playing a big part in us thinking through how to initiate this discussion around resilience in these sectors. In particular, the folks at MNERD's Mining and Minerals Division were really hopeful for us as we grappled with this particular topic of today's webinar. I'd also like to say, I think, it's been challenging for us, and I think there's still work on our end to reach out to industry and power and other commercial water use interests to fold them into this conversation. And we certainly welcome all of you if you have thoughts on that, how to do that better. And then to say this is just sort of the beginning of this discussion about resilience. We're hoping to get input from all of you through this webinar and through our website over the coming 10 days or so to finalize sort of a proposed sort of assessment surveys that we'd release in mid-October, but more on that in a moment. And with that, John, go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so in terms of today's webinar, I'm going to start, and John and I are sort of tag teaming this. Unfortunately, we'd hope Rolf Schmidt-Peterson could join us as well, but he's caught up in prep for our Texas v. New Mexico case, which trial starts next week. So hopefully he will be available and presenting with us tomorrow for the last in this webinar series. But today it'll be just me and John. So we're sort of tag teaming it. First, I'm going to give a little overview of the 50-year water plan to provide some context, and then talk a little bit about sort of the science foundation that I mentioned a moment ago, including some discussion, and this will sort of transfer over to John, discussion of specific impacts that might be related to industrial, commercial, mining, and power water uses. But really, we also want to use this time with you all for discussion, as we have done in the previous set of webinars. We want to make sure there's plenty of time for discussion for you all to speak up or use the question box on your screen so that we can kick around ideas. We'll then go over the sort of resilience framework that we've been thinking through for this sector in more detail, and then have more discussion at the end. So that's what our plan is for the time that we have with you all today. And I really want to thank everyone for joining us, and just encourage you to participate in this beginning of this discussion around resilience. Next slide, please, John. All right, so for those of you who participated in a number of these workshops, again, a bunch of these slides are going to be repeats. Then will be slides specific to this sector, but some of this you may have heard before. So I apologize if you've participated on multiple occasions. So we just thought it would be helpful to start with, what will the 50-year water plan actually contain? What is it that we're trying to do here? Because we've gotten a lot of questions around that. And I think that it's very distinct from any of the other planning efforts that the state has undertaken in the past. As you all know, by statute, we're required to work with regional folks on regional plans, as well as update the state water plan every 5 years. That update to the state water plan is due in 2023, so that's right around the corner as well. But this 50-year water plan really is Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's interest in having us really think carefully about climate change and what specifically the state of New Mexico may be facing in terms of climate change impacts. So this plan is largely focused on that, and that's where we started with this sort of science foundation, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But really, what are the current projections saying in terms of what the anticipated changes are going to be across our landscape? And then from there, and what we're in right now is sort of thinking through resilience. How do we evaluate how resilient we are to those projected changes in our landscape? Where are we least resilient? So where are we most vulnerable? Where do we need to focus our attention? And then also, where is there existing resilience that we can learn from and build on or maintain? And then lastly, the plan is intended to provide recommendations for improved resilience. So after we sort of evaluate where are we most vulnerable, or where are the biggest concerns, what does that mean about what we need to do next? And those could be policy recommendations in terms of operations, land management, adaptive strategies, hopefully things that will be helpful for local decision makers, but will also guide the state in terms of next steps. I also want to acknowledge, and I mentioned earlier, discussions we've had over the last few weeks with our partners at other state agencies, and quite a bit of work has already been done as part of the governor's executive order on climate change, which created the Climate Change Task Force to look at resilience. And so we're really wanting to learn from that work that's happened at our sister agencies and build on that in this process, and hopefully use this 50-year plan to also promote and further that work that's underway. The plan itself is intended to be fairly short, hopefully something that decision makers could pick up and read quickly to get a sort of snapshot of what we're looking at in terms of anticipated changes in our landscape and the associated consequences. So it will ideally be 50 to 60 pages, but then have appendices, and that's where, so the leap ahead, which is that science foundation, and more on that in a minute, would be contained along with other materials say from Water Resources Research Institute and the work they're doing on incorporating that leap ahead into their New Mexico water budget modeling and other materials. So that is still in process in terms of what would be included there. And then I think it's maybe helpful to also say, I'm sorry if it's noisy on my end, someone is doing a weed whacker outside of the window, so I apologize. I think it's important to sort of say what this report is not intended to do. And so, to be clear, in the state water plan, there's sort of discussion about projected supply and demand into the future. That is not included here, that sort of supply demand gap analysis. We're not tackling that here, but certainly this report will tee up that discussion for the next update to the state water plan. And then also there's no new projections or modeling being done specifically for this report. It's really relying on existing work. So I thought it just might be helpful to clarify what it is that we're trying to do with this 50-year water plan. Next slide, please, John. All right, and in terms of the context of where we are on our timeline here, it's a pretty tight timeline to complete this plan by next March is the goal from the governor's office. We started out this year with sort of launching this whole thing with the Water Dialogue's annual January meeting. And then the earlier part of the year was really focused on supporting New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources, who was tasked with the Science Foundation that I mentioned. We're now in this transition, September through November, of discussing resilience. And that's where we really want all of your expertise in helping us think this through. And then October through December of this year, and actually probably into January at the Water Dialogue's January meeting again, are focused on collecting input for those recommendations. So what sort of adaptation strategies make sense? Where should we direct resources looking into the future, with the idea of finalizing this plan in March of next year? So it's certainly a tight time frame, and we've heard from a lot of folks, oh, couldn't we have more time? And we certainly wish we could too, but this is the timeline that we're working with. And I think that, the recommendations section that we're about to head into next month is going to be really critical, with the idea that hopefully this plan will, sort of, I see it as like the spark that sets off motors that go, right? So how do we use this plan to direct efforts in terms of implementable, actionable recommendations? And so we're enlisting all of you in helping us think that through, and hope that this plan will be successful in doing that. Next slide, John. All right, so in terms of where we're at, as I mentioned, we're in the middle right now, or almost towards the end of this series of webinars, starting the discussion about how to evaluate our resilience. Last week, we talked about agriculture and public water systems and domestic wells. This week, yesterday, we talked about watersheds and habitat. Today, we're focused on industrial, commercial, mining, and power uses. And tomorrow, we'll be discussing recreation and quality of life. We also went into a little bit more depth on agriculture and public water systems, partially because we spent quite a bit of time, in particular, Amy Lewis, who's a contractor working on our team. Thank you so much, Amy. Did a lot of work thinking about those in particular, partly because from a water use perspective here at the Office of the State Engineer, 85% of water use in New Mexico is in those two sectors. So we spend a lot of time thinking on those, but that's also where we want input on those, but we also certainly want your all's input on these other sectors too, especially since they're less our wheelhouse. And so we're really relying on others to help us think through these other sectors. The plan, as I mentioned earlier, is to get your all's input. And I also want to say what we're about to share with you is a lot to digest. And so we're hoping that we'll have a fruitful discussion today on this webinar, but that we encourage you all to sort of mull it over and provide us input through a survey that's on our website. We'll make sure you have that information at the end here, so that we can take all of that in, process it, sort of take it into consideration, adjust the assessment survey and matrices that we've created here, probably circle back with our state agency partners as well before releasing something in mid-October, with the idea that water users across the state from those sectors and the public in general would use those assessments, provide us input through them that we can then incorporate into the plan. Obviously, the state is also doing a lot of thinking in terms of our perspective with regard to resilience in these sectors, and also learning from the work that's occurred through the Climate Change Task Force, as I mentioned before, to be able to reflect that appropriately, capture that, promote that in the 50-year water plan. So we'll be doing that in parallel, but we're very much wanting to use this 50-year water planning process to engage the public in thinking about resilience. So that's what we're kicking off here, and we're looking for your all's input in order to finalize those assessments by mid-October. And then coming up this fall in terms of additional events, the Water Resources Research Institute's annual conference is in late October. That's where we'll really be pivoting towards collecting those recommendations. And we certainly encourage you all to participate there. And we're grateful for those partners at WRRI for being willing to dedicate a significant portion of that conference to this effort. Then in early November, our partners at U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will be hosting workshops on New Mexico's climatic regions and the distinct sort of impacts that we're expecting to see in those regions. In November, also there's a tentative state tribal water summit planned. And then, as I mentioned earlier, sort of the last big pulse of input for this 50-year water plan will occur at New Mexico Water Dialogue's annual conference in January. So a bunch of events coming up, and we certainly encourage you to participate. There will be information on our website and lots of opportunities to provide input to the 50-year plan through all of these events and through our website. Next slide, John. All right, so in thinking about how to evaluate resilience, obviously there's a couple of different ways to come at it. And as I mentioned a moment ago, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is going to be prepping some workshops for early October that specifically will focus on, each of their workshops will focus on the four sort of distinct climatic regions that were identified in the Leap Ahead analysis. And again, the Leap Ahead is that work by New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources. And you see them outlined on the map here on your screen. So the anticipated impacts of climate change will be somewhat different in these different regions. So thinking about resilience might be important to consider which of these regions you're in and the projected changes in those regions. Another way to look at it is also by water use sector. And that's where, as you saw in the previous slide, we've sort of created, for the purposes of discussion and organizing thinking around resilience and the report itself, the five sectors that I mentioned. So agriculture, public water supplies, public water systems, watersheds and habitat, industry, commercial mining and power, and then recreation and quality of life. And I think it's important to say here, we recognize water does not stick in any one sector. So it's been challenging having discussion for each of these sectors because there's so much interplay between the sectors. For example, yesterday we talked about watersheds and habitat, and yet, of course, considerations of climate change impacts the watersheds really has to be considered in all of these sectors. If you're relying on a public water system, obviously what's happening in your watershed is a critical part there. So we know that there's a lot of overlap, but we also felt like it was important to have these sort of distinct conversations so that no specific interests or specific areas of the state were left out of the discussion. And so just to say, we know there's a lot of overlap, and also these four distinct regions, may have some similarities in terms of how they respond, but we thought it was helpful to both frame the discussion in terms of the climatic regions as well as different water use sectors. And then, in all of this, we're keeping in mind the governor's goals of sustainability, equity, and stewardship, and then ultimately how to use this resilience assessment to inform the development of adaptation strategies to increase or maintain our resilience across the state. So this is the discussion that we're in. And next slide, John. All right, so I'm now going to just provide a little bit of information summarizing some of the conclusions from the leap ahead analysis is what we've been calling it. So this is the work that was done by New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources. That was, as I said earlier, the sort of science foundation for the 50-year water plan. The reason we started here really was directive from the governor's office and her wanting this plan to have a real base in current science. And so I think the other thing that's really important to say about this leap ahead analysis is that the Bureau really focused on what does the current science say, so current peer-reviewed science say about the impacts of climate change to our physical landscape, so to the physical systems. There's a little bit then of a necessary translation of that to what does that mean for human systems or biological systems, and that piece is not included in this leap ahead as directly and or nor intended to. So that is part of the work that we're working on with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but certainly something to acknowledge up front. And I think there's also, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, a couple of big thoughts that are in my head when I'm working on this project. One is, how to talk about the uncertainties, right? This comes up with climate change, comes up in discussions of climate change often. There's a lot of uncertainty, and so, but that doesn't mean that we don't know that particular actions will be beneficial regardless of the potential range of outcomes. But then, there's maybe some uncertainty in terms of responses to our physical landscape, but certainly sort of cascading uncertainty in terms of how those changes will affect biological systems and in turn, have additional impacts. And then I think the other thing that I've thought about a lot in this process is how to successfully communicate science to lay folks and decision makers. And so all of that's been part of sort of trying to sort through this leap ahead analysis and how to present it successfully in this report and through this process. I should also say that this report, if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, is posted on our website. We very much would like to hear your thoughts on it, and we'll also be relaying comments to the folks at New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources. Next slide, John. All right, and so just to stress again that the leap ahead itself is not the 50-year water plan. It will be a supporting document. This slide shows the panelists that were selected by New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources to help assemble this report, and they're all folks that have many decades of experience in sort of peer-reviewed science related to our physical systems. And what they were tasked with doing, as I mentioned earlier, was just really looking at what does the current science say in terms of what impacts we should be anticipating given current climate projections. Next slide. So what should we be expecting? It's pretty dire. The list on this slide is, the sort of key takeaways from that report in terms of what we're anticipating. So decreased runoff and recharge due to increased aridity across the state, decreased snowpack, earlier runoff, greater demands on groundwater and surface water, increased hotter, drier, longer droughts, vegetation stress, increased forest fires, flooding, sediment transport issues, potential irreversible damage to soils, degraded quality of surface water. It's fairly overwhelming looking at what we're anticipating in terms of changes in our system over the next 50 years. Next slide, John. And that means more than ever, there's an urgency in thinking through how do we plan? How do we plan ahead together to address the impacts that we're anticipating? When we talk about resilience, obviously there's a number of different definitions out there. The definition that we've been using in our work is the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions and withstand, respond to, and recover rapidly from disruptions. So the reason that we're here today is to really start this discussion with all of you about what needs to happen to prepare for the changes that are outlined in the Leap Ahead analysis. What is it that's needed? Where are we most vulnerable? And we're really looking forward to working on this and tackling this with all of you. Next slide. Of course, some people might say, and back to the uncertainty, well, how do we really know it'll be that dire, right? So I think that's where it's helpful to just look at observed climate metrics, right? So this plot on this slide shows observed temperature and precipitation between 1931 and 2020. And clearly, when you look at that temperature plot, we're seeing temperatures increase over the past 30 or so years. That may be less true in terms of precipitation. There's not as clear of a signal, but as we all know, with rising temperatures, we'll have less water available due to increased evapotranspiration from our landscape. So inevitably, we're looking at a drier water future, and probably, the projections are for more variable precipitation. So potentially longer droughts and maybe larger monsoon storm systems. So what is needed to ensure continuing economic development and that the needs of all New Mexicans are met? And that's what we're here to try to tackle together with all of you. Next slide. The next sort of several slides are going to be from the Leap Ahead report, and the official name of that report is Climate Change in New Mexico Over the Next 50 Years, Impacts on Water Resources. But we tend to call it Leap Ahead to keep it simpler. So, we just looked at the plot of observed temperature. This plot shows projected change in temperature, actually over the next 70 years. This is based on RCP 8.5, which is that representative concentration pathway. It has to do with how much greenhouse gas emissions we have, and 8.5 is considered the sort of business as usual projection. So without significant changes in emissions, this is what we'd be looking at. And obviously from this plot, we see significant temperature increases across the state, with particularly significant increases in that northwest corner of the state. Next slide, John. And it's interesting to see what the sort of water stress index looks like across the US. In this map, you'll see that much of the eastern US is anticipating a much wetter scenario, so with the potential for flooding, and yet much of the west is looking at much drier conditions. And I think one of the things that really stands out for me in this map is just looking at New Mexico and the significant increase in water stress that's projected for us in particular and for the Southwest in particular. Next slide, John. So this slide shows, projected change in potential evaporation across the state. So potential ET obviously is if you had, sufficient water available, what would you lose from your landscape through both evaporation and transpiration through plants? And, in New Mexico, much of the time we don't have sufficient water available to meet the potential that we could lose. But so this shows the increase in potential ET, and again, you'll see the sort of significant change across the state. And this obviously is relevant for if you're thinking about, crop demand, that will increase significantly when potential ET goes up, as well as just looking at reservoir storage, what we're going to lose there, the demands of our riparian and watershed systems. So, significant potential change in potential ET. Next slide. All right, and so similarly, that means we're looking at increased aridity. So these two maps on the left here show an aridity index, which is defined as the ratio of average potential evapotranspiration to the average precipitation. So the areas that are blue, we get more rain than there is, potential ET in those areas, and vice versa for the red. The map on the far left is historical aridity index, 1970 to 2020. The map in the middle there is a future projection through 2070. And what you'll notice is certainly quite a bit of increased aridity, particularly in the southern portion of the state and again in that northwest corner. And then the map on the right shows the change in aridity in the projection. So again, you'll notice a number of areas have significant increased aridity, but also just increased aridity across the state. Next slide, please. And of course, as part of that, in thinking about our river systems, we're looking at less flow in our rivers. This is from a study of the Upper Colorado River, but I think similar changes are anticipated for stream systems across New Mexico. And if you look at the plot there on the bottom, now this analysis was done based on a number of different emissions scenarios. But if you look at that sort of worst case high emissions scenario, in the bottom plot, we're looking at 50 to 60% less flow in our stream systems, which is remarkable thinking about New Mexico and how stressed many of our stream systems are as it is. So, obviously that's the dire end of the spectrum of outcomes, but worth considering as we're thinking through what the potential impacts may be. Next slide. And then, what's interesting in looking at this map, and if you're comparing it to that aridity index change as well, there's a lot of overlap in terms of where you see the darker brown here. So ecosystem vulnerability, and I should say this slide, and in a moment I'm going to hand this over to John, but this slide now is an image from the New Mexico Forest Action Plan. And again, a big shout out to the folks at MNRD and State Forestry. They've done a tremendous job already doing a lot of thinking about resilience for our forest systems. If you haven't checked out that Forest Action Plan, I really encourage you to do so. But this slide is an image from their work and just looking at what are the ecosystems that are most vulnerable to the changes that we're anticipating. Certainly there's some areas of the state where that's significant. And I think now I'll go ahead and hand it over to John to talk through the remaining slides before we have a little discussion.
Thank you, Hannah. So we'll jump in. The last slide was about ecosystem vulnerability. And now we'll look at, again, from the New Mexico Forest Action Plan, wildfire hazard. Wildfire hazard is a function of burn probability, and you have and conditional fire intensity. Burn probability is a likelihood a fire will start and spread, where conditional fire intensity is the probability of the fire burning at a given intensity. And these kind of look into that. Again, this is showing the risk of those issues. This is looking in again at fires that have occurred over the last 20 years of burn areas. Again, from the Forest Action Plan, just looking at that vulnerability throughout our forests and kind of that vulnerability that could increase. This is looking into our erosion susceptibility and also our post-fire erosion hazard, which after a burn, probability of erosion hazard of where that would increase the erosion after that post-fire. Again, wildfires will create bare and damaged soils and that are more susceptible to erosion, and that erosion will cause sediment loads in your riverways. Again, just erosion itself will have those sediment loads also. So just to look at that risk and vulnerability. Looking at that wildfire risk, again, today we're talking about industry, commercial power, and mining and power. Again, looking at from our forestry division, the risk of areas that have wildfire risk association with electric transmission, where our power line data is available, and kind of the wildfire risks to communities in the index. This piece was a project priority that was going to focus on areas with high wildfire risk of communities within cooperative boundaries of provided co-op data. So just to look at that kind of risk that fires could be started by these issues. Again, looking at where locations of power plants throughout the state. This is where all our power plants within the state of New Mexico are, just from the FEMA Resilience Analysis and Planning tool. Just the location of where all these are compared to the last maps looking at the risk. Looking at where all the energy and minerals, the mining minerals are located throughout the state. This kind of maps out where our mining industry is and location is throughout the state. And then again, the use of dams is a big piece with the industry and power industry and mining. So this is from both the past state water plan and the leap ahead, the maps provided, and they're looking at the location of all the large dams and their ownership, whether it's federal, local, private, state, or public utility. And then many, again, of our, as you look at the map on the left, you're looking at one that shows whether those the status of the conditions of the dam. And so these are dams that are poor, fair, or satisfactory in status or unsatisfactory, and there are quite a few that are poor or unsatisfactory conditions. Again, with the decrease in surface water, it all brings in an issue of vulnerability to all our sectors, including industry, commercial, mining, and power. Again, that decrease of flow, again, for surface water discharge is we're seeing that decrease and seeing that in projections due to decreased snowpack, runoff, and drought. Some impacts from extreme events, again, as we saw in the location of all the large dams throughout our state, kind of where that would be an issue is where we have an increase of extreme events that will increase the amount of flooding and sediment loading and causing issues for this sector of use. These maps look into where our 500-year floodplain depth is, and then also kind of the increase in probable max precipitation in inches of what we're looking at as a projection into the future. So again, those are a lot of projections and even current locations of where industry, commercial, mining, and power is. What we want to talk about now is just have a discussion about those vulnerabilities, where people see how that affects them. So I'm going to put up a poll. We've used these polls in the past 3 presentations. So let me put it up and please participate. All right. So our question was, how vulnerable do you think we are to the changes that are coming based on the sector we're talking about today, industrial, commercial, mining, and power? The survey came out, or the poll was 19% believe that we're extremely vulnerable, 38% say we're very vulnerable, and 56% say we're somewhat vulnerable, and 0% believe minimally vulnerable. So let's start on that discussion. For those that said we're somewhat vulnerable or extremely vulnerable, is there a reason for that for industry, commercial, mining, and power? Are there any main concerns or questions on what we've touched on?
And this is where you all can jump in if anyone wants to just speak up or write in the question box, or we can continue and have more discussion at the end.
We do have one question. Water used in mining not reusable, question mark. Isn't it pollution?
You know, I'll just comment on that briefly. I'm not sure exactly what was intended by this question, but I do see that there's a few people on today, even that have been involved in a lot of discussion around produced water. And so I think that, you know, there's a lot of effort and work underway, especially our colleagues at NMED and thinking through, you know, what the options are for produced water and its reuse both inside and outside of the oil field.
And then we do have another comment regarding power. I believe there aren't any significant hydropower sources in New Mexico. Thermal power plants do use water for cooling. Thanks for that comment.
Yeah, and I sort of said this at the beginning. This is Hannah again. We haven't engaged much with folks from the power sector in our initial work on this resilience assessment, and certainly would welcome any suggestions from you all about who would be good to engage as we continue this work.
There's another. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say there's a good comment from Bob if you want to go ahead and read that. Thank you, Bob.
Besides generation, power resilience needs to consider impacts to transmission, and especially new transmission that will come with dramatically increased demand to feed electric vehicles. And then there's another comment and question: power lines starting fires. How good is the state at minimizing this?
And just to comment there, you know, I think that part of the discussion yesterday with regards to our watersheds certainly entails fire prevention and fire management as a consideration. And so that's where that discussion is happening with regard to that issue. I would say, John, why don't we forge on, and then there'll be more opportunity for discussion at the end here.
All right. So just to look into our different water use sectors, again, industry, commercial, mining, and power are combined are our fourth largest use sector in the state. And just to see that usage is high, looking at the 2018 water use report. Again, way we're going to look into resilience within industry, commercial, mining, and power is by resilience is improved by water supply diversity, sufficient water availability with high stream flow, thick aquifers, surface and groundwater, sufficient infrastructure capacity, watershed health, demand management ability with shortage sharing agreements, conservation plans, drought management plans, and safety measures during and post-production, infrastructure, emergency plans, remediation plans on that. Again, looking at water supply diversity, again, industry, commercial, mine, power that have more than one source of water, more resilient. Surface water only are kind of more vulnerable to drought, where groundwater only are vulnerable to the declining water levels. Again, some of it has to do with also the ability to be in a location that has those two sources. So this just looking at the ability to have a water supply diversity for these. Again, looking at a map, this was used in many of our past presentations of how surface water availability systems with a high ratio of the minimum flow ever recorded to the surface water demand indicates a greater resilient. So just looking at areas where stream flows are, if there's more available surface water, you're going to have a much more resilient location of that. Again, groundwater, again, stream connected aquifers are more resilient. Again, also if we could have a map of that showed the depths of our different aquifers, many, as you see, that aren't stream connected are at risk or are in locations on the eastern New Mexico where we do know that it's a declining aquifer. So but to show that also is something to consider. Again, groundwater availability is very important towards resiliency. Again, sufficient infrastructure capacity to address projected changes. Again, if sufficient saturated thickness of water column in a well when pumping, sufficient capacity to store raw water for usage within the industry, commercial, mining, and power, and then sufficient infrastructure for increased extreme precipitation events and flooding and sedimentation, the ability to handle that flooding, to handle that sedimentation issues that will come with larger storms. Again, the location of our reservoirs and dams in New Mexico for flood control, industry, rec, and drinking water, just the location of where this raw storage is throughout our state, to give an idea of something to think about as we talk about with that sufficiency of infrastructure, the ability to store that raw water. Again, touching on watershed erosion risk and health, kind of our watershed health. Again, the erosion risk caused again as an issue, and again with wildfires as another issue. In that, it's important to look as whether you're resilient or not based on some of these issues that are going to cause issues in our surface water systems that are used through industry, commercial, mining, and power. Again, the post-fire erosion risk, again, we touched on earlier where the fire will damage cause bare grounds and damage the soils where they would cause higher risk of erosion that will build sediment loading in the streams. So again, it also be an issue for just the movement of earth and possible landslides. That would be an issue with industry, commercial, mining, power. Again, just touching on what we mentioned even earlier, again, the 500-year floodplain and dam safety. And the kind of the greater the height above the floodplain, it's greater resilience to avoid damage. Systems downstream of poorly constructed and maintained dam are more vulnerable to risks from these storm events, and even facilities that do use these dams are at risk of issues because it's important to have those maintained dams taken care of and looked after, especially for usage and their location. And again, demand management, having shortage sharing agreements, adjudicated areas, having that drought emergency plans in place, and recycling and capturing stormwater for usage within the industry, commercial mining power as a reuse to lower the amount of demand is of importance for resiliency. Again, safety management, you have your infrastructure, again, looking at the design and operation and maintenance of the facilities, making sure that you have a pre and during production plans of making sure that everything is being maintained for resiliency and that and managed, looking at the emergency response plans, making sure if there is an extreme event or issues, emergencies such as drought or issues of floods, that these response plans are in place. And then even remediation plans for remediation after post-production, making sure that within the industry, commercial mining power, that the remediation plans are followed and taken care of to make sure that that will limit the possibility, making sure that that industry, commercial mining power is with being resilient in that concept. And this is our draft matrix. I will give us a few minutes to take a check at it again. It covers all the pieces that we were discussing earlier with water supply, diversity, supply, availability, surface water and groundwater, kind of the infrastructure capacity for having with the aquifer and reservoir storage. With safety, you have infrastructure, the ability with design and operation maintenance, you have emergency response plans, remediation plan, and watershed health for, post-fire erosion, fires themselves, erosivity risk, and then demands, having the ability to adjust as the demand increases. How do you adjust with possible recycling, capturing, and sharing agreements with utilities and other sources around you. So this is just a look at that. I'm going to give you a few minutes and then we'll put up another poll.
And John, I just want to, this is Hannah, thank again our colleagues at Mining and Mineral Division at MNERD for helping us start to think through this a little bit. They were very, very helpful, and we certainly hope to get additional input from you all participating today.
Let me put up this survey because we'll take it and then it will jump right back to this screen. So I'm going to launch this. Again, this is asking how well does this matrix capture necessary considerations related to the resilience of industry, commercial, mining, and power sector. All right. So again, to that question of how well do you think this matrix captures necessary considerations for industry, commercial mining power, 31% say very well, 62% say somewhat well, and 0% say not well. So let's just start discussion on those that are saying very well or somewhat well. What are your reasoning behind that? Feel free to unmute yourself and start a discussion.
And I guess I would say I'd particularly like to hear from the folks maybe that say somewhat well and what they think could be improved here, but any comments would be welcome.
I do have a question to repeat the results. Yep, and the results were 31% said very well, 62% said somewhat well, and 0% says not well. I do have one comment. Stream-connected aquifers are extremely dependent on the existence of stream flow. The Rio Grande, when it flows, is by far the dominant source of recharge to the Mesilla Basin. Thank you for that input. Are there any comments, questions?
Good afternoon. This is Paul Montoya, Farmington. One of the things that I think could be improved in this is if there's some kind of relationship between the kind of water quality that industry needs and the possible pollutants that could be found in the stream beds, and hopefully not the aquifers, but that's been known to occur. So I think that's one thing that would be interesting to know something about. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment.
Any other comments or questions?
This is Paul again. And one more thing that's kind of interesting as well. On our side of the state, the Colorado River is continuing to get more salinity involved. And it'd be interesting to know how that affects industry's ability to continue to manufacture products and that sort of thing. So I think, I'm not so sure that salinity is the only problem in the state. I'm sure there are other problems, but it'd be interesting to know if there are other situations that are causing industry to kind of change their water use a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. You raised some really good questions about water quality and the needs of industry for very, specific water quality parameters. And I think that's something for us to definitely think about here. And in general, in the 50-year plan as well, what the anticipated changes are to water quality across the state. So thank you.
Well, and another thing too, in terms of Albuquerque and, well, Rio Rancho, I guess, more accurate, the chip factory that's made there and how they are handling their water quality issues, if that's causing them a great deal of grief or not.
Indeed, good suggestion. Any other thoughts or comments? Certainly encourage you all think about this more. As I said earlier, and some of the feedback we've already received is it's sort of we're throwing a lot out there at once for people to think through. And so I very much encourage you, as I said earlier, to review these materials. They will be on our website, these presentations, and think through it and provide us feedback that we can incorporate. That's what we're looking for here. And I know sometimes it takes a little bit to sort of digest all of this.
There
And
is
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
There is a question that came out / comment. It would be helpful to know if remediation plans are funded, realistic, or just a plan.
Good point. Thank you for that. Okay, well, I think I would say let's move on. We just have a few more slides here, and then we can ask if there's any additional thoughts before we wrap up for the day. It looked like, was that another question that just came in?
Yeah. What about the ability to react smoothly to desire for more of their product, electricity, minerals, etc.? Can you explain number 2? Let's see. Surface water ratio, minimum flow to 2000 surface water diversion, not clear on that. I believe, let me see.
So I think, so first on the first comment, I think that's a good thought, Bob. Like, what are going to be the increasing demands on these folks? I think one of the things that we've struggled with a little bit is sort of constraining this exercise to what the change in impacts to water resources will be for these folks. But, you know, I think there's something there for us to think about a little bit more. And then on the next question on number 2, and maybe I can ask Amy to explain this, but I certainly could take a shot at it too, but it looks like Amy's on.
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, why not? Thanks, Amy.
Okay. Right, so I think the question was, why does it say 90 to 100% surface water and 0 to 10% surface water?
Oh, I think it's number 2 actually was the if you could explain criteria 2.
Okay, sorry, I can't see all the questions. They're delayed coming into me. It's the ratio of the minimum, or it's the ratio of the minimum flow ever recorded in the stream based on USGS stream gauges to the demand of the water system. So if the minimum flow was 1,000 acre feet in a year, and their demand is 500 acre feet, that ratio would be 2. If the minimum flow was 100, the ratio would be 0.1. So the more flow in the river at that very lowest ever recorded flow, the higher the ratio.
And obviously this applies to entities that rely on surface water flows to meet their demand. But if you're relying on surface water, and then you could use that criteria to evaluate your resilience. Hopefully that helps. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Hannah, do you want me to move to the next slide?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? All right, so some of this is the discussion that we were sort of trying to get going through this presentation. You know, we very much want your input. Are we approaching this problem in the right way? Sort of what's left off? What's the best way to get this discussion going? We encourage you to think through all of that and provide us information. especially through our website. And next slide, John. So as I mentioned earlier, this presentation, including that draft matrix, will be on our website, and there will be a survey specific to this discussion of evaluating resilience for industry, commercial, mining, and power open on our website through October 9th. We recognize that that's a limited window, but we want to get input so as to be able to sort of finalize these assessment surveys by the middle of October. We encourage you to participate there. And also, as I mentioned earlier, if there's other contacts that you all have in mind related to this sector in particular that you think would be helpful for us to engage with, we welcome you to share that with us as well. And then next slide, John. So again, this information will be on the website along with the survey and this presentation. So we encourage you to look for that there. And then next slide. I think this is our final slide. We really, and before we wrap it up, I'll ask if there's any more thoughts, but we really encourage you all to participate in this process overall. If you have any comments or feedback related to the leap ahead, as I mentioned earlier, there's ability to provide that comment on our website, as well as lots of information about the upcoming events that I just mentioned, and ability to comment on the process in general. If you are not on our email list and would like to be, please feel free to email the email at the bottom of the screen here. And before we finalize for today, just wondering if there's any last comments or questions before we wrap up.
There is one comment. I am unaware of any significant industry, mining, power, or even commercial uses of water. It's almost 100% agriculture or domestic, commercial, and other, which includes livestock watering, is a tad over 2%. Those numbers are for the lower Rio Grande, Elephant Butte to Texas. Based on the statewide water use numbers, our categories report, industry, commercial, mining, power came out with around 6% of the use statewide. And so it is a small amount, but it is still a significant number of use. And it does impact all the other uses throughout the system. So it's important that we look at the resiliency. Paul, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I'd like to comment on that too. And that is, although statewide, it may not make that big a difference to an individual watershed, it may make a huge difference. You know, for example, like here in the Farmington area, we have a lot of oil and gas industry. And so their demand for water compared to what our water supply actually is pretty significant. And I realize this is surface water too, but still, I think an individual watershed could have a particular industry that demands a lot of water for some reason.
Thanks, Paul. And I think just on the piece, you know, so far in a lot of presentation, there's been discussion of how these, why we separate these sectors. And I think, you know, it's important that with these different sectors is to kind of look within them, but how they work together. If they're all resilient, then it's going to work together in kind of a web to make everything better. But we need to address and look at the resiliency of each sector of use on that. So, but yes. Are there any comments or any further discussion on this subject or any more questions? We did get one. What's true in Farmington is also true in the Southeast. Takes a lot of water to frack and finish a well, and that is true.
Well, I just want to again thank everybody for your participation today. I see there are some folks on who are our diehards, and we appreciate all the time that you guys have spent with us. Encourage everyone to join us for our final one of these webinars that is tomorrow afternoon. And again, really encourage you all to think through this and send us your input. We're looking forward to incorporating it. And I think, unless there's any more questions or comments, that may be it for today.
This is
Yeah.
Paul, and I have a quick question. In this area, are you going to be looking at this as a state as a whole, or are you going to be looking at this as individual watersheds as you have other areas in this planning process?
The goal would to do the same as the others, where it's broken down or summarized by its climatic region, and then kind of because again, we want to look at the climatic vulnerability that's going to go, since different elevations, different locations throughout the state, you're going to see different climatic issues. And so, yeah, this will be summarized in smaller than statewide, but it is important to kind of see on some pieces that might affect, especially dams and stuff like that might affect with outside of the climatic region. We'll still want to talk about that and think about that as we start discussing adaptation strategies.
And then I would just add to that, thanks, John, that we may not be calling out specific users or specific areas of the state per se, but certainly highlighting what appear to be sort of the greatest risks or the greatest vulnerabilities, and also hopefully highlighting where there are good practices that could support resilience in place and what we can learn from those.
Absolutely. Well, with
All right.
no further ado, we do have one more webinar tomorrow. I hope everybody participates in that. It's on recreation and quality of life. It will be at 2 p.m. Hope everybody can make it for that. Again, the surveys are located on our 50-year water plan website. Jump on there, participate, give us input, because the more input we get, the better these will be. So thank you for your participation, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.